And that leads me into my next phase, which is about what is the source of knowledge. And also, I'm going to pose the gentle argument that sophists and philosophers are not quite as different from each other as Socrates would have liked to believe. First of all, a little joke here. I may be aging myself here, but this is Richard Nixon, who famously said, "I am not a crook." So that is Socrates' head superimposed on Nixon saying, "I am not a sophist." Socrates does not present sophists in a positive light at all. In fact, the light is excessively negative most of the time. There are a few quotes that I captured here that I wanted to share, also just to demonstrate that this is a rather consistent viewpoint carried across several dialogues. So I'm just going to move like a clock here. So up at the top from Meno, I am not teaching the boy anything, but all I do is question him. Sounds like Socrates. Then from Apology, I have never been anyone's teacher. Then from Protagoras, wouldn't you be ashamed to present yourself to the Greek world as a sophist? Then from Gorgias, sophistry is a form of flattery, not a true craft. That is a paraphrase, which is why it is not in quotation marks. Also from Gorgias, sophists and orators do not know what to do with themselves, and other people don't know what to do with them. And then finally from Theaetetus, there is no wisdom in me, and that is true enough. So all evidence for I am not a sophist. But let's go a little bit more deeply into this. First, a beautiful painting by Francois-André Vincent, which is Alcibiades receiving the lessons of Socrates. We have this quote from Gorgias where Socrates says, remember, Gorgias was a sophist. He says, well, Gorgias, I think there's a practice, points out four different practices that he thinks are craft like, but they are not actually crafts. He calls them flattery, that they sort of mimic the real crafts. He says, I think there's a practice that is not craft like, but one that a mind given to making hunches takes to, a mind that is bold and naturally clever at dealing with people. So he's saying the people who will become these professions are not actually crafts, but they are master manipulators, if we could say it that way, or a little kinder, they are master rhetoricians. They're very naturally clever at dealing with people. He calls this flattery. So he's saying that I think that this practice has many other parts as well. Pastry baking is one of them, which I thought was really funny. This part seems to be a craft, but in my account, it isn't a craft, but a knack and a routine, distinguishing between what is a craft and what might be a skill. I call oratory a part of this too, along with cosmetics and sophistry. He's lumping sophistry, which is teaching for pay, right? Collecting tuition. He's lumping that in with the knack or flattery of cosmetics, oratory, and pastry baking. He says these are four parts and they're directed to four objects. So this is interesting. So Socrates is distinguishing between philosophy, which he considers this great art that is central to everyone's education, and sophistry, which he says is a form of flattery or imitation of a real craft. So very interesting presentation here of what he believes sophistry to be, the role of the philosopher in society. And this picture is of Thales or Thales, who was a famous astronomer who fell into a well. So as far as we know, this is the first known mention of this fable or story of the astronomer who fell into a well. And Socrates says they say that Thales was studying the stars and gazing aloft when he fell into a well. So he's so busy looking up at the stars and trying to study the stars that he walks into a hole, right? It says that a witty and amusing Thracian servant girl made fun of him because she said he was wild to know about what was up in the sky, but failed to see what was in front of him and under his feet. So this story actually was published in Aesop's Fables later and is referenced in many other pieces since. But from my research, this was the first time that this fable or story of Tails, who was too busy studying the stars to notice the well right in front of him, that this was the first time that this was referenced. Socrates goes on to say that this same joke applies to all who spend their lives in philosophy. So philosophers are like Tails, are like astronomers, people who are looking up at the sky, studying what is interesting to them, so much so that they can't see what's in front of their feet. It really is true that the philosopher fails to see his next door neighbor. He not only doesn't notice what he is doing, he scarcely knows whether he is a man or some other kind of creature. The question he asks is, what is man? What actions and passions properly belong to human nature and distinguish it from all other beings? This is what he wants to know and concerns himself to investigate. So, as Tales and astronomers study what's happening in the cosmos, he says similarly, philosophers are tasked with defining what is man. How does it function? What distinguishes it from all other beings? And that is what he says that philosophers are doing and why they can't be bothered to even learn menial tasks. He also says that things like they don't know how to cook and can't clean up after themselves, etc., because they are just too busy trying to figure out the purpose, the meaning of life. Here's another fun one. This comes from a book called Mimosophy, Socrates the Fool. In Theaetetus, Socrates actually refers to himself as a midwife. So this is going to be in two parts. In the comic to the side here, we see a man saying to Socrates, Socrates, I'm losing my mind. Will you stop with all these questions? And he says, don't worry, my mother is a midwife, and finding the truth is just like giving birth to a baby. It hurts at first, but when the baby comes, the parents are happy. Okay, but please be careful. So this idea is actually floated in Theaetetus. So Socrates talks about the fact that his mom is a midwife or was a midwife, and that he himself is also a midwife. But he says, now my art of midwifery is just like theirs, meaning other midwives, in most respects. The difference is that I attend men and not women, and that I watch over the labor of their souls, not of their bodies. And the most important thing about my art is the ability to apply all possible tests to the offspring, to determine whether the young mind is being delivered of a phantom, that is, an error, or a fertile truth. For one thing, which I have in common with the ordinary midwives, is that I myself am barren of wisdom. There again, he's the infamous ignorant. The common reproach against me is that I am always asking questions of other people, but never express my own views about anything because there is no wisdom in me, and that is true enough. So, in the next frame of this comic, it says 1 hour later. So, here are the things we agreed on. One, you think you know things, but you don't. Two, you're just as stupid as I am, except I know it and you don't. Three, you even have the idea that you are some kind of big shot who should charge people for his advice. So obviously he's talking to a sophist. In conclusion, you are an arrogant, ignorant, and a. But you said I would be happy once this discussion was over, that it was like giving birth. Well, some babies are more irritating than others. And so, in conclusion, Socrates does come back full circle to his discussion of himself as a midwife at the end of Theaetetus. And he says, and so, Theaetetus, if ever in the future you should attempt to conceive or should succeed in conceiving other theories, they will be better ones as the result of this inquiry, even though they spent this really lengthy dialogue going through the three different definitions of knowledge and the three different definitions of an account and trying to define knowledge and coming up empty. Socrates does not sound hopeless. He actually says that because they had this conversation, he says to Theaetetus, if ever in the future you should attempt to conceive, having another idea, meaning attempt to define knowledge with another idea that we haven't covered yet, or you should succeed in conceiving other theories not related to the definition of knowledge, they will be better ones as the result of this inquiry that we just went through. And if you remain barren, meaning childless, as he's making his extended metaphor here, but if you don't get any new ideas, your companions will find you gentler and less tiresome. You will be modest and you will not think that you know what you do not know. So Socrates sees this as a plus, right? That one is aware of their own ignorance. He sees that as a strength and something that is valuable and commendable. And so he wants Theaetetus, who is largely in his own image, to also be modest and humble and aware of his own ignorance. And he thinks that's okay. We don't know everything. What we are seeking to do is to attempt to learn, and we are attempting to learn every day of our lives. This is largely, I think, what he dislikes about the sophists. He doesn't like that the sophists pretend to know because he doesn't believe that they do actually know. I think Socrates believes that all people are rather ignorant, and he seems to be seeking wisdom and never actually truly finding it, or only finding it in specific crafts or specific skills. So he's making a comment there, sort of an offhand comment, comparing a sophist to a philosopher, even though Theaetetus's teacher is actually in the room when he says this. The next thing that I would like to show you is something from Dr. Andrew Moore of St. Thomas University in Canada. He has this really phenomenal take on what can be learned from Gorgias, which I think also applies to some of the other dialogues in which Socrates speaks to sophists or about sophists. But I'm going to share a couple of quick clips with you from this longer video, and I will also share this slideshow when I post this so that you can access this in its entirety as well as any of my other sources if you wish. But I'm going to share this with you so that you can see an outsider's interpretation, just a minute or two, of what might be gleaned at a under the surface level. So perhaps a deeper intent of what Plato might have been trying to say, or separately, what we might glean from these works with how we see instruction and education and learning today. So I'm going to share this with you and I'll be right back.
Hey everybody, it's Dr. Moore. We're going to talk about Plato's Gorgias. So Socrates' first question in this dialogue is, what does Gorgias teach? And Gorgias and Polus are actually pretty cagey on the subject of what Gorgias teaches. And it's a little weird early in the dialogue that they won't come right out and say what it is that Gorgias teaches. Chaerephon is able to get a preliminary answer out of Polus. He gets Polus to say that Gorgias' teaching partakes of the most admirable of the crafts. But that's pretty vague. And when Socrates turns to start questioning Gorgias, Gorgias too gives these wishy-washy sorts of answers. First, he says that his teaching is concerned with the source of freedom for mankind itself. And at the same time, it is for each person the source of rule over others in one's own city. But when Socrates pushes Gorgias a bit further, he retreats to an answer much like Polus's. I teach the greatest of human concerns, Socrates, and the best. Again, very vague. Okay, so this conversation between Gorgias and Socrates raises two big questions. The first is a question about Socrates, and the second is a question about us. Question 1. What does Socrates teach? Remember, Socrates says to Gorgias, if you claim to be a teacher of justice, and you claim to understand justice, your students should not do unjust things. If your students do unjust things, it must mean either that you're a bad teacher or that you don't really understand justice. So what does this mean for Socrates? He seems to understand justice, and he seems to be a teacher, but he has a famously unjust student, Alcibiades. Alcibiades was a highly regarded young Athenian. He was a brilliant general and reputedly very beautiful. His name comes up multiple times in Plato's Gorgias. Socrates loves Alcibiades and tries to teach him philosophy, but Alcibiades famously had a tyrannical soul. In fact, Alcibiades is banished from Athens during the Peloponnesian War because his fellow Athenians believed he aspired to tyranny. Socrates is put on trial in part for corrupting the youth of Athens. And that charge, it seems, is maybe particularly about Alcibiades. So, if Socrates knows so much about justice, why do his students do unjust things? Okay, And here's the second big question, the one about us. When we study the liberal arts, or even philosophy, what is that study about? Gorgias suggests he's in possession of a special kind of knowledge, and that he can teach people how to think and communicate in a way that will advance their careers and let them succeed in any endeavor at all. Doesn't it kind of sound like they're talking about the liberal arts? Isn't that how we talk about the liberal arts and liberal education? How often, for example, have you heard people praise the critical thinking skills you're going to acquire at university? Well, what are critical thinking skills? What do they help you think about? Maybe your response is, why, the greatest of human concerns, Dr. Moore, and the best. We always talk this way about the liberal arts. They'll teach you critical thinking skills that will lead to many possible careers, meaningful lives, and service to society. I mean, this all sounds good, but isn't it just as wishy-washy as the stuff we hear from Polis and Gorgias? What are critical thinking skills? What are we teaching you to do? Here's the thing we need to ask ourselves. Are Socrates' questions for Gorgias also questions for us? When we talk about the liberal arts this way, are we like Gorgias? When we study something like philosophy or a subject like justice, ought we to be teaching you thinking skills that help you problem solve? Or do we actually need to be teaching you morality, goodness, teaching you what justice is? Socrates seems to incline towards this second option, that if you're studying something like philosophy or the liberal arts, you ought to be acquiring real knowledge about the most important things. Thanks for watching.
All right, welcome back. Hopefully you found that as meaningful as I did. I really like the connection between Gorgias and modern education, particularly as an educator myself. I taught high school for 10 years, and I actually had a student once tell me that if I didn't teach them morality, who would? And that really stuck with me. And then when I came across this analysis of Gorgias from Dr. Moore, he seems to be saying something similar of should we be thinking about what we modern sophists teach? Is it enough to just teach the facts, to teach the history, to teach the basic skills? Or should we be teaching about morality, as Socrates did? So this takes me to my next slide here. Socrates clearly made consistently, as you'll remember from I am not a sophist, he made a number of very clear statements separating philosophers from sophists. But this does not seem to be universally understood or agreed upon. So the title of this slide is Philosophers as Unpaid Sophists. So with the exception of collecting tuition, what is it that makes them different from each other? And as you may have noticed in your own research, as I did, Socrates is frequently referred to as a teacher, like repeatedly, often in the names of these paintings. Like even this one down here, you'll see that the title of this painting is Alcibiades being taught by Socrates, even though he rather famously said that he has never been a teacher. It is kind of widely understood that Socrates did a lot of teaching. And I would argue, even in Meno, when he is saying that he's not teaching the young slave boy how to do geometry, but he's just asking him questions. And he says that he's showing him how to recollect the knowledge that he somehow already knows. Inquiry-based teaching or inquiry-based learning is absolutely a legitimate form of learning and a legitimate form of teaching. There's a distinction that Socrates is making that I don't quite understand with my modern lens or my modern comprehension of teaching. But he's frequently referred to as a teacher by many throughout history and even during this time. Obviously, the Council of the Apology, when he is in the court and is defending himself against corruption of the youth, they clearly saw him as an educator, regardless of the fact that he makes the argument that he is not a teacher and has never accepted pay for his work. That's why I have there, is he an unpaid sophist? As such, was Socrates responsible? So, going back to the video we just saw from Dr. Moore, was he responsible for the actions of Alcibiades and others, as he claimed Gorgias was responsible for the actions of his students? Plato and Socrates were very concerned about justice, virtue, and knowledge. And obviously, Socrates spends a great deal of time talking about these topics with many people. And often the people that were in his audience were much younger than him, like Alcibiades, as we see in this picture, who may or may not have been his lover, but was definitely his student of sorts. As we saw in Symposium, Alcibiades learned a great deal from Socrates. He waxes poetic about how much he learned from Socrates and how Socrates helped him value his life and care about what kind of person he was. And even though he does go on to make mistakes and goes on to be seen as a rather tyrannical young man who was quite obsessed with the pleasures of the body, it seems. Just look up some Alcibiades art if you're curious about that. He went on to be something that really didn't fall in the image of Socrates. However, Socrates does make that argument himself when he's arguing in Gorgias about virtue and saying that there are, or perhaps that's in Protagoras, when he is arguing that there may be very virtuous men who have very not virtuous sons, and that it isn't really possible. That is in Protagoras, because he's arguing that it's not possible to teach virtue, that somehow apparently this is something within us, or at least something that a sophist isn't capable of. So the idea here comes full circle. If Socrates spends all this time in the company of people who are listening to his discourse and are clearly attempting to learn from him, but he doesn't consider himself a sophist, was he responsible? And I think that takes us to the next level of, should teachers be held responsible for the actions of their students in general? And that carries us to another idea, as we are starting to see become more common in modern America, when a child commits a very serious crime and the parents are held legally responsible for that child's conduct. It kind of falls back to this same idea or this same premise of whether or not one's teacher, which could also be one's parents, are responsible for the actions of their students or their children. So, some fun facts about Theaetetus. Uh, the first two are about the timeline. I'm sure this video is getting a little long, and if it is over, I will cut this and leave it so that you can explore it on your own. But timeline one indicates there is still not a clear consensus of when Theaetetus was actually written or when the frame story of Theaetetus was written. So, in the frame story, Euclides states that Theaetetus is being carried back to Athens after being wounded in a battle in Corinth. And scholars disagree as to whether this was the battle that happened in Corinth in 391 BC BCE, when Theaetetus would have been in his 20s, or in 369 BCE, when he would have been in his 40s. The editor of our book goes for the latter. Timeline 2. In the final lines of the dialogue, Socrates shares this rather ominous line. And it's ominous to us because we understand the connotation here. He says, I must go to the king's porch to meet the indictment that Meletus has brought against me. But let us meet here again in the morning, Theodorus. It just gives me chills because, as we know, when he goes to King's Porch, he is going to the scene of the apology, right? And before he gets there, he goes to Euthyphro. So he actually has quite a few back-to-back dialogues. The whole other conversation about how Plato was able to get those dialogues. But we know that Socrates very shortly thereafter this conversation with Theaetetus is convicted and sentenced to death and then is dead. So it's a little bit ominous and a little bit unnerving in the sense that he says, let us meet here again in the morning, Theodorus, because he won't be able to do that. And the fact that this was published quite a bit later, when the frame story was written, may mean that that line was deliberately ominous, as Plato would have already been aware that Socrates was leaving for his death. Another fun little anecdote that I threw in here is the epic burn of Socratic proportions. Theodorus says to Socrates, but as a matter of fact, if you'll excuse my saying such a thing, he is not beautiful at all. but he's rather like you, snub-nosed, with eyes that stick out, though these features are not quite so pronounced in him. Epic burn of poor Socrates with his snub nose and bug eyes. That is Theodorus talking about Theaetetus. Another fun fact about Theaetetus is that it might provide us with some insight into Plato's technique. So, as with Phaedo and likely other dialogues, Plato is not literally present for the dialogue with Theaetetus and his teacher. In fact, it's twice removed because Euclides also was not present. But Euclides claims to have heard the dialogue from Socrates himself, taken notes, and written it down. This description that Euclides provides, some have posited that this might actually be Plato either defending his method. Perhaps he'd been questioned about it, or questioned about his plagiarism or his tendency to fictionalize what Socrates actually said, especially when he was writing posthumously. But it's hard to say. This could also just have been Euclides' method and Plato wrote it down. I'm not sure. But Euclides says, when I went to Athens, he, being Socrates, repeated to me the discussion that he had had. I made some notes of it at the time. As soon as I got home, then afterwards I recalled it at my leisure and wrote it out. And whenever I went to Athens, I used to ask Socrates about the points that I couldn't remember and correct my version when I got home. The result is that I have a pretty well the whole discussion in writing. So some have posited that this might have been Plato's method for how he was able to record so many of Socrates' dialogues, even when he wasn't actually there, so that they were somewhat accurate. I obviously am going to pick this apart a little bit, but we need to remember that this was a time period when people were certainly accustomed to memorization, as we saw in Protagoras, when just off the cuff, Socrates is able to recite poetry. He clearly had it all memorized. And I think that at this time when so much less was written down and so much was studied and learned orally, it's much more likely that people were able to more successfully memorize extended periods of dialogue and to recall them with generally decent accuracy. Of course, we don't know that for sure. All we have is what remains. I also wanted to point out here that editor J.M. Cooper included at the introduction in our text to Theaetetus that he implies that this actually might be plagiarized because he says, since ancient sources tell us of Socratic dialogues actually being published by Euclides, it is as if, except for the prologue or the frame story, that Plato actually is giving us under his own name one of Euclides' dialogues. So the editor themselves is coming in and saying, hey, this might have been written by Euclides entirely, and Plato might just be publishing it under his own name. Yikes. Not cool for modern English teachers, but maybe because he says it was Euclides' piece in his publication, maybe that's a decent citation for ancient Greece. I don't know. Right at the end of the slide, you'll find a link to my complete works cited if you would like to see all of those citations. And thank you for your time. Hit me up on the discussion board or you can email me here, and you are welcome to look through this slideshow at your leisure. I have included it posted along with this video. Take care.